Morning. My name is James Sanderson. I'm the evangelist and minister here at the Brown Street Church of Christ in Waxahachie, Texas. It's a little cold today. That's right. Winter is coming. Christmas is just a few days away, and it's getting a little cold here in Texas for Texas weather. Glad to have you with us today. You are actually in the middle of a series on examining the Seventh Day Adventist Church. That's what we're going to look at. Now, this is going to be part 2 today, and we're going to look at their history and their doctrine. Now, we basically covered their history in last week's lesson. So if you didn't see that lesson, go back and watch number 1 first before you get to number 2, okay? But we also want to look at their doctrine. What do they teach? What do they believe? And one of the things that's very prominent about the Seventh Day Adventist Church is their beliefs on the Sabbath. Okay? The Sabbath. So we're going to really examine that today. We looked at it last week, and we're going to finish it up today. And again, this is part 2. So let's get started today. Now, I want you to realize you are on my YouTube channel. So if you'll just type in, if you've never been on there before, Saving Souls in the 21st Century, that's going to open you up to 2 channels that I have. One are my newer videos, one are my older videos. I have over 200 videos out there on all kinds of subjects on the Bible. Get on there and see if something is helpful for you. And if it is, and you think it'll help others, send those videos out, use them. They're all Bible-based. See what you think on these subjects. And if you would, hit the subscribe button on there, because the more people that subscribe or hit likes on these videos, if you like what you see, that'll just further out and get this out to more and more people. And that's what we're about. We just want to get it out to people because it's Bible. All right. Now let's get started with our lesson. Our goal is what? Our goal is the same goal that Jesus had. Do you know the one thing that he prayed for that we all be in the 21st century? That we all be one. That's the one thing he prayed for us for in John 17, verses 20 and following. That was what he prayed for, that we all be one. Well, are we? No, we're not one. I was just at a local denomination here in our area, okay, just the other day at an event with the police department. And I was talking with their youth minister, and I was saying, do you ever find it odd that you don't teach or believe the same thing as the church right across the street from you? He's like, you know what? I guess we don't, do we? I said, no, you don't. You guys have vast differences in your beliefs and what you teach. And if you just go just down the road, there's another church going north. I said, do you teach and believe the same thing they believe? No. We're different from them also. And they don't teach the same as the people across the street from us. I said, that's right. And what about the ones farther down the street and then down around the corner and some more over here and some more over there? In fact, what's happening is you've got all these people teaching all these different things, all supposedly coming from one Bible. Is that unity? No, it is not unity. We are very not unified in our world today when it comes to Jesus. And yet Jesus is going to give us the way to get there. In that same prayer, he's going to talk about this sanctified group of people. Sanctified means set apart, okay? So Christians have been set apart from the world, okay? We're not unified with the world. And this group is to be one. And how do you get there? By the truth. And what is truth? Jesus says it, it's thy word. So if we are going to have unity, we've got to start with the Bible. And I got to tell you that not all the things that are being taught and believed are coming from this Bible. So that's what we want to do. We're going to take the Seventh Day Adventists and their doctrines. We're going to put it to the test of Scripture. And we're going to see one of two things. Either what they're teaching is correct, and I need to change what I believe on the Sabbath, okay, and practice what they teach, or what they're teaching does not match with the Bible, and they need to change. And I'll learn that not only from me, but so I can better be prepared to reach them. That's what we're going to do in this study. That's our goal, okay? But when we do that, when we do come to this truth, we're going to do what Paul said in the church in Ephesus. He says, speaking the truth, you got to speak the truth, okay? The Bible says what it says, but you got to do it in love and kindness. So let's make sure that when we go out, we are always speaking the truth in love, okay? That's our goal. And hopefully, when we do that, that will bring all doubts that people have, and it'll bring them to faith. Faith has to be based on the Word of God, which is the truth. Okay? So that's where we're going. All right, let's go. So last week, this is what we seen. We needed to look at the beginning of the Seventh Day Adventist Church. So we wanted to look at their history and background. So we're just going to do a brief review of what we looked at last week. Where did they get started at? They got started with the Millerites. That's right, the Millerites. This is William Miller, okay? And he made this claim, you can see it right here in this article, that the world was going to be destroyed in 1843. All right? Now, how did he come to that conclusion? Well, he did a math equation, okay? So the Seventh-day Adventists are big on the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation, okay? And they take some math and they do an equation with it. They get a starting point, an ending point. We're going to really look at this next week. And they come up with this math equation that brings them to this year. But when they got to that year, they had to change it because 1943 things weren't going the way they were supposed to. And Jesus, sure enough, didn't return to this earth. So they changed it to 1844. And when Jesus didn't come back in 1844, guess what happened? It was called the Great Disappointment. And the Millerites were no more. That's the end of them. So they went away. But then there was a remnant of the group that reformed off of these beliefs. And they reformed about 19 years later. And they were called the Seventh Day Adventist Church. Here is their main prophetess. Her name was Ellen White. She lived back in the 1800s. And they take a lot of their theology and beliefs from this lady. Okay? She is the co-founder and prophetess of the Seventh Day Adventist Church. Now, they got their start in Battle Creek, Michigan, and you can actually go to some reading rooms there and read what she wrote, these visions that she had that were supposedly coming from God. And a lot of their beliefs and theologies come from her visions. Okay? And just to remind you, the Seventh Day Adventist Church is all over this world. All right? They are everywhere. And they're really growing big time overseas. So they're big in Brazil, India, Zambia, the United States, and the Philippines. Okay? But they're everywhere, as you can see on this map. And they are the fastest growing denomination, at least back in 2018, that this world has today. All right? So, we need to know about them. So now let's talk about their doctrines. You can see it in their name, Seventh Day Adventist. Seventh Day Adventist. Okay? Seventh day, Sabbath, okay? And the second advent of Christ, or the coming of Christ, okay? So this is where their theology is made up of, these two words. Last week we started focusing on the Sabbath. Today we will finish up. Okay? And then next week we're going to get into the second part and the Advent and see where this all comes from. We're really going to get into the book of Daniel on that one. Okay? So here's Doug Batchelor. He's one of their very prominent guys that teaches for the Seventh Day Adventist. I've watched him many times. Maybe you've seen him on TV. He's holding the Bible there. If you've ever studied with a Seventh Day Adventist, they know their Bibles very well. They're very well trained in them. The question is, are they correctly trained in them? That's what we're going to try to see. So here's their first argument, okay, why we need to keep the Sabbath. If you know a Seventh-day Adventist, they're going to tell you, you have to keep the Sabbath, okay? That's Saturday, the seventh day, right? Here's their arguments why they're going to tell you that you have to keep it. Because God made the seventh day holy. We covered that in last week's lesson. God made all kinds of things holy in the Bible, and yet we don't practice any of those. Okay? Just because God makes something holy. So we looked at that last week. We covered that pretty well. Go back in my video and watch that in the first lesson. Their second argument is that the Sabbath was an everlasting covenant. And absolutely, it's exactly what it says in Exodus 31. We covered that last week also. And we've seen that there were several things that were everlasting covenants. But they were all fulfilled in Jesus. Their third argument is that the Ten Commandments and the Law of Moses are different. Okay? So what they're going to say is, look, we're under the Ten Commandments. We have to keep the Ten Commandments. Sabbath is commanded to be kept in the Sabbath, or in the Ten Commandments. But the Law of Moses, where the animal sacrifices, burning of incense, keeping the Day of Atonement, and all those things, that is of the Law of Moses. We don't do those. So they separate those two. And what we saw last week as we covered this, is that they are both the same. You can't separate them. So if you're under one, you're under all of it, or you're not under any of it. And we saw very clearly in the book of Romans and the book of Ephesians, we're not under any of it. It is gone. And again, it's all fulfilled in Jesus. So those are the first three arguments that we covered in last week's lesson. These are the three that we're going to cover today. Argument number 4, that the Sabbath in Colossians 2:16 is talking about other Sabbath days in the Bible and not talking about the weekly Sabbath. Now, you may be asking a question here. What does Colossians 2:16 say? Give me just a minute and we're going to go see that, because that's a very powerful verse. Their fifth argument is that Jesus and the Apostle Paul and others kept the Sabbath in the New Testament. So if they kept the Sabbath, New Testament, then we got to keep the Sabbath. Okay, that's our argument. We're gonna examine that one. And then argument number 6, their last one, is that the Seventh-day Adventists believe that the Catholic Church changed the Sabbath from Saturday, the seventh day, to Sunday. And that anyone who is not a Catholic, that would be, in their world, they would call them Protestants. They've all been polluted by the Catholic Church. And so anybody that's under that heading would be polluted by the Catholic Church. And they're here to straighten us out. That's what they believe. Okay, that's their argument. We're gonna look at that one. So now let's look at some time for some answers. Let's put some answers now. We're going to take their argument and we're going to put it to the Bible. Here's argument number 1. Is a Sabbath day in Colossians 2:16 talking about, they believe it's talking about other Sabbath days, and it's not talking about the weekly Sabbath day. Let me show you what it says. Here's Paul, and he's talking to the church in Colossae. And he says, therefore, don't let anyone judge you. So if someone comes to you along to you and judges you, says, look, you need to do this. Paul says, don't let them judge you by what you eat and drink. Now, under the law of Moses, there were things that you could not eat or drink, okay, under the law, okay? One is barbecue that we eat a lot here in Texas, all right? Paul says, don't let anyone judge you on that. Or with regard to a religious festival. Well, did they have religious festivals in the Old Testament? Absolutely. Day of Atonement, Passover, Pentecost, all kinds of days, right? If you don't keep those, don't let anybody judge you. Or a new moon celebration, they had those also. Or a Sabbath day. Don't let anybody judge you and say, you got to keep the Sabbath. Well, that's exactly what the Seventh Day Adventist Church says. You got to keep the Sabbath. Paul says just the opposite here. So the Seventh Day Adventist argument is this isn't talking about the weekly Sabbath. This is talking about other Sabbaths. Okay. I hear what they're saying. We're going to put that to the test. And then he's going to give the reason of why you shouldn't judge anybody on these things now that we're under the new covenant, because it says these are a shadow of the things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ. Christ is the fulfillment of all of these things. Okay? So, let's go look at this argument they have. Were there other Sabbaths besides the weekly Sabbath? Well, let's go see. So here's the weekly Sabbath. If you go over here to Leviticus 23, Leviticus 23 is a very interesting chapter in the Old Testament because it's going to list out their feast days. Okay? Here's one right here. The 6 days shall work be done, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work. It is a Sabbath to the Lord in all your dwelling places. So on the Sabbath, you are to do what? No, not any work. Nothing. Okay? Here's the next feast day. Okay? It's the feast, well, you've got the Passover, and then you've got the Feast of Unleavened Bread. This is when they exited out of Egypt. Now watch what this one says. On the 15th day of the month, the Lord's feast of unleavened bread begins. For 7 days you must eat bread made without yeast. On the first day, hold a sacred assembly, and do no, here it is, no regular work or ordinary work. For 7 days, present an offering made to the Lord by fire, and on the seventh day, a sacred assembly, and do no regular or ordinary work. Now, just look at this. Does that have a little similarity to the Sabbath? Right, it does. Do no regular work, but there's a little bit of difference. Because the Sabbath said do no work, but this one is a little different. It says do no regular work. Wonder what the difference is. Well, let's go back to the day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread when it first began. We're going to go all the way back to Exodus 12 and see if you can't find the difference. On the first day, hold a sacred assembly, and another one on the seventh day. Do no work at all on these days, except, here's the exception, to prepare your food for everyone to eat. This is all you may do. So under the weekly Sabbath, you couldn't do any work. You couldn't even prepare your food. But on this day, this one, you could cook your food. So there's a little difference, isn't there? Yes. And let me just ask you a question. When it talked about the Feast of Unleavened Bread, does it actually, in the text, call it a Sabbath? No, it does not. Let's look at another one. The Feast of Pentecost, or the Feast of Weeks. Leviticus 23:21, and you shall make a proclamation on the same day. You shall hold a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work. It is a statute forever in all your dwelling places throughout your generations. So, again, does this have a little ring to it of the Sabbath? Yes. Don't do any ordinary work. But it's not the same as the weekly Sabbath, because on the weekly Sabbath you were to do no work. Do you see a difference? And did it call this day a Sabbath? It did not. Now it's got some similarities to it, but it didn't call it a Sabbath. Here's the Feast of Trumpets. Leviticus 23:23 through 25. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel, saying, In the 7th month, on the 1st day of the month, you shall observe a day of solemn rest. Oh, solemn rest. Okay, there's a ring of the Sabbath, right? A memorial proclamation with blast of trumpets, a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work. You shall present a food offering to the Lord. So again, it's got the ring of a Sabbath, but did it ever call it a Sabbath? No. And is there a difference from the weekly Sabbath? Yes. Yes, there's a difference. Because here you can just not do any ordinary work. So here's the things to consider when we looked at this list. Nowhere does the Bible call these feast days Sabbaths. It just doesn't. Okay? The weekly Sabbath, though, it sure did. These feast days took place once a year. The weekly Sabbath took place once a week, so there's a difference. These feast days took place on different days of the week, so they shift. So it's moving on the calendar. It might show up on a Thursday one year and a Tuesday the next year, kind of like your birthday, right? Your birthday shifts. Weekly Sabbath always fell on the same day of the week, Saturdays. So there's a difference. And these feast days, you could cook your food. Unlike the weekly seventh day of the Sabbath, you could not. Right? On that day, you could do no work. On these days, you could do some work. So there's a difference. So that's something to consider when you hear the Seventh Day Adventists say, that's what Colossians chapter 2, verse 16 was really talking about. It was really talking about these other Sabbaths. Don't let anyone judge you on these Sabbaths. But the Sabbath, the Saturday Sabbath, oh, you got to keep that one. Paul wasn't addressing that one. And I'm like, are you sure about that? Let's keep going. So my conclusion is, when we look at Colossians 2:16, we clearly see a distinction between, in the text, religious festivals. Don't let anyone judge you on a religious festival or a Sabbath day. There's a distinction between those two. Now, even though some of the Old Testament feast days have some slight similarities to the weekly Sabbath, there are still major differences between the two. Thus, to imply that Colossians 2:16 is talking about feast days as a Sabbath day, and not the Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath, is to clearly go beyond the text. Would you agree with that? I think that's a strong argument. Okay? Well, let me throw a little wrench in things. What about the Day of Atonement? This is interesting. So now we're going to go to another feast day. All right? And it says here about the Day of Atonement in Leviticus 23. It says, And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Now on the 10th day of the 7th month is the Day of Atonement. It shall be for you a time of holy convocation, and you shall afflict yourselves and present a food offering to the Lord. And you shall not do any work on that very day. Did you catch this? No work. None. For it is the day of atonement, to make atonement for you before the Lord your God. So that sounds similar to the Sabbath, doesn't it? It does. For whoever is not afflicted on that very day shall be cut off from his people. Now, the word afflicted here, I know you're asking this question. What does it mean to afflict yourself? This in the Hebrew means to fast. This was the only day that the Israelites were commanded by God not to eat. You couldn't even eat on this day. So you couldn't prepare your food the day before because there's nothing to prepare for because you're not eating tomorrow. Okay? You had to afflict yourself. So that's different than the weekly Sabbath, isn't it? Because you could eat on the Sabbath, right? And whoever does any work on that day, that person I will destroy from among his people. You shall not do any work. It is a statute forever throughout the generations in all your dwelling places. It shall be for you a Sabbath. It's behind my picture. A Sabbath. There it is. There's the word of solemn rest. And you shall afflict yourselves. On the 9th day of the month, beginning at evening, from evening to evening shall you keep your Sabbath. So there is more than just the weekly Sabbath. Now here the text actually calls this a Sabbath. Now, James, what are we going to do with this one? Here's some things to consider. The Day of Atonement is called the Sabbath day, just like the weekly Seventh Day Sabbath. Okay, there's similarities there. On the Day of Atonement, Israel was not to do any work. They could do no work. That's the same thing that the weekly Sabbath said. So there's some similarities there. But here's what's not similar. On the Day of Atonement, Israel was to afflict themselves. They were to fast. You could eat on the weekly Sabbath. You could eat on that day. You just couldn't cook your food that day, but you could eat. On this day, you couldn't eat at all. And the fourth thing is the Day of Atonement was celebrated once a year, and the weekly Sabbath was celebrated weekly. Okay? So there is some similarities, and there is some differences. But here's the conclusion. Even though the Day of Atonement is the only feast day of the Old Testament called a Sabbath, there are also many differences between the Day of Atonement and the weekly Sabbath. So if I'm going to come along and I'm going to make this claim that Colossians 2:16 was actually talking about the Day of Atonement as a Sabbath day, and this is what Paul was talking about, that don't let anyone judge you on that day, that's going beyond the text. Because if he's going to do that, wouldn't he just say, don't let anyone judge you on the Day of Atonement? But see, he already covered all those days back up in the sentence before when he says, don't let anyone judge you on a religious festival. That includes the Day of Atonement, the trumpets, Passover, Pentecost, Feast of Unleavened Bread. It covers all that. And so he's making a distinction between the feast days, which this is, and the Sabbath. Don't let anyone judge you on a Sabbath day. Now let me just ask this question. If we're to keep the Sabbath as the Seventh Day Adventists teach, the Seventh Day Adventists break the Sabbath. They will drive in their cars to get to worship farther than what it is said to travel in the Old Testament on the Sabbath. So thus they are breaking the Sabbath. Okay? If they do dishes or any kind of work on the Sabbath, they are breaking the Sabbath. And if you broke the Sabbath, what's the penalty for that? They were to be stoned to death. Does the Seventh-day Adventists practice that? If they did, they would be on the world news today, wouldn't they? Yeah. Yes, they would. No, they do not practice that. So when they say you need to keep the Sabbath, they're really not keeping the Sabbath. They're breaking it. They are violating that. So that's some things to consider if you're studying with one of them. Ask them about those things in love in kindness. We're not here to give them a hard time. Just say, can you explain that to me? Why do you pick and choose and go, well, you keep this part of the Sabbath, but you don't have to keep that part of the Sabbath? I mean, to me, it's like you got to keep it all or you don't keep any of it. Let's move on. Argument number 5. Did Jesus, the Apostle Paul, and others in the New Testament observe the Sabbath? They claim that they did. Okay? Well, let's see. So let's talk about Jesus and the Sabbath. We're going to go over here to Galatians chapter 4, verse 4 and 5. And it says, but when the time had fully come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under what? Under law, to redeem those under law, that we might receive the full rights of sons. When did Jesus live? When was he on this earth? He was here during the law. So, under the law, what did you have to keep? The Sabbath. Do no work on that day, right? Okay. Did Jesus keep the Sabbath? Yes, he did. Why? Because he lived under the law. That's why he kept the Sabbath. So the Seventh Day Adventists are correct. He did keep the Sabbath, but he had to because that's where he lived. That's the time that he lived under. We don't live under that time. Now let's talk about the Apostle Paul and others, them observing the Sabbath. Okay? So you're going to see the Apostle Paul go into synagogues on the Sabbath and go in and teach people. Seventh Day Adventists are going to say he's going in there because he's observing the Sabbath. Let's see. So what does Paul say here in Galatians? This is the same Paul writing right here. In chapter 4, verse 9 through 11, but now you know that God, but now that you know God, or rather known by God, how is it that you are turning back to those weak and miserable principles? Do you wish to be enslaved by them all over again? You are observing special days and months and seasons and years. I fear for you that somehow I have wasted my efforts on you. Could you imagine coming out of the old covenant, making that switch into the new covenant? Okay? You had been brought up under this, brought up under the law of Moses, did all of these things, and all of a sudden, when Jesus comes, now we're going to move into a new covenant, and there are changes. That was hard on these people when they're coming out of Judaism and coming into Christianity. Okay? Lots of changes when covenant changes. And so here people are trying to go back to that and keep those special days and those months and those seasons and years. Paul says, have I wasted my efforts on you? That stuff is over. Now here's my point. If those days are over, then when Paul went in and kept the Sabbath, or went in on the Sabbath to preach to people, was he actually keeping the Sabbath? Or was he doing it to try to reach the Jews because that's the day they came together? It's got to be that he's only in there not to keep the Sabbath. He's actually going in there just to reach them and bring them out of their old religion. Because if not, how could he write this? He would be contradicting himself, wouldn't he? And here's another one. How could he write this? Don't let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or regard a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. If Paul is actually keeping the Sabbath, how could he come along and say, don't let anyone judge you, and say you got to keep the Sabbath? That's a total contradiction. Again, what was the reason that Paul and others were going in and on the Sabbath and teaching people? They were going in there to reach them, not to keep the Sabbath. There's a difference. When you come to Christianity, all that old goes away. Because why? Because It was a shadow of the things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ. Does that make sense? Makes sense to me. Conclusion. When you look at Jesus keeping the Sabbath in the Gospels, from Matthew to the book of John, he did this because he lived under the old law. When we see Paul and others in the book of Acts teaching people on the Sabbath, they did this to reach them and to teach them about Jesus, not to keep the Sabbath. Therefore, Paul was not keeping the Sabbath on the seventh day as the Seventh Day Adventist church supposes he did and teach. I believe they're incorrect here. And the text will tell you that. You've got to look at the text when Paul went into the Sabbath in these synagogues and see why was he going in there. Look at the underlying purpose. It wasn't to keep it. It was to bring those people out from under that old way and bring them to Jesus. Here's our last argument. The Seventh-day Adventists believe that the Catholic Church changed the Sabbath from Saturday, the seventh day, to Sunday, the first day. And so they believe that all of us have been polluted by this. Well, let's see. So the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Daniel chapter 2, and I should have put on there chapter 2, chapter 7, and chapter 8. We're really going to get in this in the next lesson. So I don't know if you're familiar with the book of Daniel. Very interesting book. In Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar is having a dream. Okay? He has this dream of this great statue. And there's 4 kingdoms there. Okay? Very clearly, go back to the text, you'll see the word kingdom. And there's 4 of them. And so the statue is split up into 4 pieces. You got the Babylonian kingdom, that was King Nebuchadnezzar himself in this vision, and the Medo-Persians and the Grecian Empire, and then comes the Roman Empire. Notice on this chart is produced by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. They are going to say, no, we actually have a 5th kingdom. Text does not say that. Go back and read it. There's only 4 kingdoms. And so they're going to turn this into papal Rome, okay? Because, again, they're going to show that papal Rome came in and tried to change everything, okay? All right? So here's those 4 kingdoms, okay? That's what the text says. A 4th kingdom, not a 5th kingdom, okay? Now watch what's going to happen into that 4th kingdom during Rome. In the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it itself will endure forever. When did Jesus come to this earth? During the Roman Empire. That's right, okay? Look at Luke chapter 2 and Luke chapter 3. It'll tell you the 2 Caesars, the Caesars that he was born under and died under, okay? That's when he came to this earth. And what did he do when he came here? He set up his kingdom, right? And that kingdom will never come to an end. All these are going to come to an end because a rock's going to come in, slam into all these kingdoms, and bust them apart. They're all going to be destroyed, and they're gone. Just go look for any of them. They're gone, right? But not this kingdom. Now, that's the context of Daniel chapter 2. They come along and say, no, we're going to extend that and actually put a 5th kingdom in there. And we're going to say this is papal Rome. Okay? So, God set up his kingdom, the church, during the time of the Roman Caesars. Not during the time of Catholic popes. Okay? And if you know anything about Daniel, Daniel 2 is a dream that Nebuchadnezzar's having. Daniel chapter 7 is a dream that Daniel is having. And he also has a dream of 4 kingdoms. So there's some similarities between these chapters for sure. Now watch what the Seventh Day Adventists do. They're going to jump over from 2 and jump over to 7. Now watch what it says in 7. Okay? Now before we get there, this is what they believe. And I hope I can read most of this. My pictures be in front of it here. But it says early believers kept Saturday as the Sabbath until March 7th, 321 CE, or I should say AD, when Pope Constantine passed a law requiring believers to worship on Sunday. The day the pagans worshiped the sun god, believers still kept Saturday as the Sabbath until another law was passed 11 years later. This law, signed into decree by Pope Constantine, forbid believers to worship on the Sabbath, Saturday, and it was punishable by death by the Catholic Church. Okay? Now, he says that many believers still kept the Sabbath uh, and died, but that these believers still kept the Sabbath up until this time. Well, everything we've seen, the believers did not keep the Sabbath up until this time. This is about 300 years after Jesus, okay? So what they're going to do is they're going to say, see, do you see what that Catholic Pope did? Well, that Catholic Pope is actually in the book of Daniel. He's predicted. And he's predicted in Daniel 7. Now, just like Daniel 7, it's just like Daniel 2, there's 4 kingdoms. There's the same 4 kingdoms. Instead of a statue, it's animals, but they're still the same 4. They're going to say that this 11th horn is papal system. That's the wrong context. Okay? Now, then they're going to go over to chapter 8. Now, in chapter 8, if you know anything about this, it talks about 2 kingdoms. And it very specifically talks about those 2 kingdoms. First kingdom, and it's, you don't have to guess this. It's the ram with 2 horns. This is the Medo-Persian Empire. Okay, they're going to come. Okay, then another kingdom is going to come in. This is that goat. It's going to ram into that ram and knock it to its feet, destroy it, and that's going to be the Grecian Empire. That's what the text says. And inside of that Grecian Empire, you've got this great horn. This is King Alexander the Great. He's going to be broken off. Okay, he's going to die. He has 4 generals who are going to take over, and that kingdom is going to be split into 4 places. Just get any history book out, and you can see that very clearly. And then out of one of those 4 is going to come a little horn. And this is where the Seventh Day Adventist Church really focuses on. It's this little horn. But stay with history, okay? And you will see who this guy is. He is Antiochus Epiphanes, and he's going to go down and just desecrate the temple, and then he's going to be destroyed. And this is what we're going to see in our next study. Now, that's what this chapter is about. They're going to say, no, this chapter is about the Catholic Church, and that he is actually the little horn. This is actually papal Rome. Daniel chapter 8 is talking about that. They left the context. Again, they're leaving context. They're trying to add something to fit with the Catholic Church and go, see, they changed it, and it was written back here in history. It's not talking about the Catholic Church. It's talking about the Medo-Persian Empire and then the Grecian Empire. Wrong context. You've got to stay with context. If you change context, you can make the Bible say anything you want it to say. And that's what they're trying to do. Now, have we all been influenced? They use the word Protestants, okay? Have they all been influenced by the Catholic Church? Well, let's see. What happened here on the Feast of Weeks or the Feast of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2 when we come to it in the New Testament? We see that the church began on the first day of the week. So, Here's Leviticus 23. We're going to go back to the Old Testament. We're going to see about this feast day. It says that you shall count off yourselves from the day after the Sabbath. There was always a weekly Sabbath during the Passover. You take that Sabbath, okay, from the day that you brought the sheave of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be completed. Count 50 days to the day after the 7th Sabbath. Then you shall offer a grain offering to the Lord. So let's put this together. Here's Jesus. He dies, right? During the Passover, there was a Sabbath, Saturday. Okay, this is when he was in the grave. You are going to count off 7 Sabbaths. Now, let me ask you a question. What is 7 times 7? It is what? 49. Then you are going to add 1. There's your 50. And that means that the day of Pentecost always fell on a Sunday. Always. Always. Now, what happened on this day of Pentecost that we clearly see always fell on the first day of the week? There was an important thing that happened that day. The church began on the first day of the week. In Acts 2, the day of Pentecost had fully come. They were all with one accord in one place. Who was together? The apostles. Okay? Day of Pentecost, first day of the week. They were all with one accord. Now, here's a trivia question for you. What kind of car did the apostles drive? A Honda Accord. Okay. All right. Enough for the humor. Okay. All right. Let's move on. What happened on this day of Pentecost? Verse 41. Those who accepted his message, Peter's preaching, were baptized. About 3,000 were added to their number that day. And then verse 47 says, and the Lord added to the church daily those who were being saved. This is the day the church began. And when did it begin? On the first day of the week. First day of the week. Do you think that's by chance? No. So that means that the first day of the week has some significance. Okay? Jesus also did what on the first day of the week? He rose from the grave. That's right. And that was actually on the Feast of First Fruits. Okay? This is John 20. That's an Old Testament feast day. He's actually raising on that day. That day was always on the first day of the week also. And then you get to Mark 16:9. When Jesus rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene. So, Jesus rose on the first day of the week. Okay? So, this is where all of our hope rests, is in the resurrection. So now, under the new covenant, that first day of the week has significance. First day of the week, Jesus rose, and we also see the church began on that day. And the early church worshiped on the first day of the week. We're going to see that in Acts 20. So you go to Acts 20. On the first day of the week, we came together to break bread. We specifically came together to break bread on that day. And you got to ask this question. Why is Paul making that very clear? Why is he saying on the first day of the week? Or not Paul, this is Acts chapter 20. Paul is there, but actually Luke is writing. Why is Luke, the inspired writer, making this very clear that it's the first day of the week? Because there's some significance to this. They are worshiping on this day. They're breaking bread. They're taking communion on that day. So you see the early church was doing this on the first day of the week. Then you come to 1 Corinthians 11:18. For first of all, when ye come together in the church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and I partially believe it. So there were some problems in the church, okay? They're going to be addressed in this chapter. When they came together. Now, the text doesn't say when they came together. But let's go a couple chapters later. Paul says, do what I told the Galatian churches to do. On the first day of every week, each one of you should set aside a sum of money and keep it with your income, saving it up so that when I come, no collections will have to be made. Paul is coming to Jerusalem. He's going to Jerusalem. There's a famine down there. He's going to collect money from the churches in both Galatia and then in Corinth. He's going to collect that money. He's going to take it to Jerusalem. Now, when does he say to save it up on? The first day of the week. Why? Because it implies that that's the day they met together. Paul's like, I don't want to have to go from house to house to house to house. When you guys come together, I can collect it all at the same time. You're all together. That implies that when it says when you come together as a church in chapter 11, it's going to tell us what day they came together. It's going to be on the first day of the week. Does that make sense? Sure does to me. So now you're starting to see that this is when the church met, was on the first day of the week. And not only does Scripture tell us that, but history confirms that. So you get back here and you get with writers like Justin Martyr and others, okay? We call them the church fathers. It's just a name we put to people. It says by the 2nd century, Justin Martyr wrote in his apologies about the cessation of Sabbath observance and the celebration of the first or 8th day of the week, not as a day of rest, but as a day of gathering to worship. 8th day is the day after the 7th, okay? So we can see here that even history tells us this is when the church met on the first day of the week. So here's my conclusion. We today worship on the first day of the week, not because we as Christians were influenced by the Catholic Church and polluted by them. I really don't care what the Catholic Church says. I want to know what my Bible says. But we worship on Sunday because that's the pattern we find both in Scripture and in history. That's why we focus on the first day of the week and not the 7th day of the week. Not because some Catholic Pope come along and says, oh, we changed it. I don't care what the Catholic Pope said. I want to know what God says. So, are we under the Sabbath today? And the answer is, no, we're not. No, we're not. We're not to keep the Sabbath. Because if we are, then we need to start doing it, right? But most of us don't. Don't worry, because the Bible says clearly we're not under the Sabbath. And I hope this is making sense for you, and you can show this to somebody else. It's been a long study. There was a lot in here. But hopefully by sharing this information in love, it may just cause the Seventh-day Adventists and so many others that are now going in this direction, called Sabbatarians, question what they have been taught. If they see that they have not been taught correctly, the truth is going to set them free. And hopefully they'll change. Hope this study was helpful for you. Guys, I just got to share one more thing with you. One more thing to think about. And that is on evangelism. I am big into evangelism. I got a workbook in English, Spanish, DVD videos, thumb drives, all to put in your hands to get you out, to spread the gospel. If you are interested in any of this, you give me a holler. That book in English, it's been translated in 9 different languages, and so it's all over the world. I would love to help you to evangelize to this world. I would love to come and share an evangelism workshop with you. This is the many places that I've been. Here's some of the recent ones that I've been at, but there's a long list, and you can go back slowly and look at this list. If maybe some of these churches are close to you, and you can ask them how well we did. But I would love to come and do that. And if you want to contact me, contact James Sanderson at the Brown Street Church of Christ in Waxahachie, Texas. There's the phone number. Get on my email, saginawpreacher@yahoo.com, and my savingsoulstoday.org is There's a website that's soon to come up. It's not up yet, but we're working on it to revamping it, and it should be up shortly. This is all to help you to get out and reach the lost for Jesus in love and in kindness. Hey, this was part 2. We've got part 3 and part 4 that we're going to look at in the Seventh Day Adventists, and we're going to really look at the second coming of Jesus and what they teach on that. And we're going to get big into the book of Daniel and a little bit into Revelation. Hope you stay with us. Hope this was a blessing to you. We will see you next time. I love you guys. That's why I do these videos. God bless you.